that's I think a really important thing to underline. And then kind of thirdly, we need to figure out a better delineation between entertainment and information. There's nothing wrong with pop science. There's nothing wrong with kind of pop politics. But the constant mixing of entertainment and serious content has not helped us. And this is not even necessarily the problem of consumers. In many cases, I know from experience, it's the problem of producers, people in my business. And it is something we have to untangle.
Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers? We have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Justin Ling. Justin is a freelance investigative journalist covering national security, technology, politics, information warfare, and where these things intersect. We start our conversation about the right-wing media ecosystem and its effect particularly on U.S. politics. We discuss why there isn't really a counterpart on the left, and what makes Canada different from the United States in this regard. We move on to talk about democracy and authoritarianism on the international stage, and how to develop healthy media consumption habits in today's world. There is so much to learn from my conversation today with journalist Justin Ling on Podcast for Inquiry. Justin Ling, welcome to Podcast for Inquiry.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you. I met you in April, and I think it's important that I note that we're recording this on September 17th. I've been wanting to speak with you for several months, and I'm really glad that I have the chance today. The topic that I want to talk to you about today took a somewhat tragic turn last week, and it has become, it already was relevant, but it has become increasingly relevant. You gave a talk a few months ago about the right-wing media sphere, and I want to explore what that is and why it's relevant. And I'd like you to start by kind of defining it and why you think it is important that people are aware of its existence.
Right. So I'm going to do that. But first, I'm going to totally ignore your question and say something else. Only because I was thinking about this today. The speech I gave to you folks, the one about this right-wing media ecosystem, had a bit of a thesis to the middle of it, which basically went that America is heading to a world of post-extremism. And the thesis, the core of this argument, was that Donald Trump had so effectively weaponized this media ecosystem and had so effectively, obviously, used it to gain re-election, that a lot of the traditional extremism that we saw come from his supporters and people who generally, occupied the same space on the political spectrum, that extremism would sort of fall away and or be turned into a sort of paramilitarism, right? And I can unpack a lot of that in a few minutes, but the flip side of the argument that I made was what we could see is a rise in left-wing extremism, more or less. I still don't know if that's going to 100% be the case, but the last couple of weeks have had me thinking about this, because both between the assassination of a healthcare CEO and potentially the attack on Charlie Kirk, we may be seeing exactly that kind of come to fruition at the moment. But it also dovetails exactly with what was the other kind of core of my talk, which was the rise of this right-wing media ecosystem, of which Charlie Kirk was just an unbelievably big figure inside of. And it is hard, I think, for a lot of people to sort of fully grasp or appreciate, right? Like it's that old proverb about a whole bunch of people feeling different parts of an elephant and not being able to fully tell that it's an elephant. The size and scope, impact, and sort of uniqueness of the right wing media ecosystem is really hard to describe. It encapsulates genuine neo Nazis, but also, George Bush conservatives now. It crosses from podcast to YouTube to Rumble to Getter to Telegram and a whole bunch of other places, and it trades in a kind of unique dialect of politics that I think was foreign to a lot of us, but is increasingly the position of the U.S. government. So we're all kind of forcing ourselves to get kind of caught up on. It is a movement that is both sort of a traditionalist, but also has aspects of this sort of almost Mussolini style futurism. It is reactionary, but it also is weirdly diverse. It is conspiratorial anti-government, but also is now pro-government in the sense that it is deferential to the U.S. state. It is a really weird thing, and I can talk about a ton of examples. I'm sure we'll get into some, but it is. We are in a strange upside down world that does not really have a lot of historical parallels and is really hard to describe because it is so complicated. But it's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, obviously, and have been obsessing more and more about even just over the last few weeks. Sorry, it's a big answer, I know.
Yeah, and I kind of want to retract a little bit of what I said in my opening question, because I characterized it as right wing, and in that I was sort of mimicking your the tone of the talk that you gave at the Ontario Humanist Conference, Ontario Humanist Aesthetic Conference back in April. But when I think of like traditional conservative, traditional Republican, traditional what is in theory right wing, or at least and I'm of an age where it might have a different meaning. But when I think of mainstream right wing thought, it is limited government. It is pro free trade. It is pro free speech. And on each of these core tenets and others, what we're seeing from what we think of as right, or what are often referred to as right wing parties across the world, but primarily, I think, for the purposes of our conversation in the United States, are none of these things. The government is growing massively, right? When you think of the unprecedented monies that are being thrown at ICE, like that is a national police type, quasi-police, quasi-military force. That's huge government. Free speech is being quashed, particularly in the past week. But people are being picked up off the street for writing op-eds in college newspapers. As far as free trade is concerned, like trade agreements have been ripped up, if not literally, then in practice, massive tariffs have been placed on countries from around the world. Is it fair even to look at what is now the federal Republican Party in the United States and call it a right-wing party?
Yeah, I actually think it's an easy answer, which is just yes,
Okay.
but with a big asterisk, on it, which is
Okay.
that in time, particularly in times of sort of anti-democratic illiberalism, not that we have that many examples in modern history, but we have a handful. In those times, parties tend to kind of pervert themselves in a bunch of ways you wouldn't totally expect, right? Very little about Stalinism was socialist in flavor, right? It was fundamentally totalitarian and collectivist without actually being really socialist. Very little about National Socialism was socialism. Very little about it was conservative either, right? It actually had a strange merging of the welfare state, corporatism, and sort of traditional conservatism. You look at someone like Hannah Arendt, who I think underlines the role that nationalism has in sort of destroying traditional tenets of ideology or politics. I think it can also point to the role that conspiracy theories and misinformation play in sort of perverting traditional standards of what these movements are. But all this to say is that Donald Trump's political movement is of by and for conservatives, right? Like, and the way they talk about it is conservatism, and functionally there is no real conservatism in America anymore that isn't Trumpism. If you consider yourself a conservative but not a Trumper, you live in a weird netherworld where the only people who will talk to you are liberals, and you effectively become a liberal. Like, you can look to an organization like the Bulwark, which is a great media outlet, which started as an emphatically conservative media outlet, has become functionally a liberal outlet. And this is not a denigration of them. I think they're a wonderful organization. Certainly, they still have some conservative ideas in the mix, but it is a functionally liberal outlet because it has had to define itself so diametrically opposite to Trump's perverted, weird conservatism. So if you are in America and you're a conservative, you're for Trump. And if you're not, you're irrelevant. And that has allowed them to be everything, right? Like, they are neoconservative and they are isolationist. They are libertarian and also they're huge statists. They are for small government but for big government. Like, everything is incoherent. But because they code themselves as conservative and because they occupy the space for conservatives, conservatives have to refashion themselves in that image. So, is it in keeping with the ideals of traditional conservatism? Is it Hobbesian, right? Like, is it, free marketeering? Is it free trade? No, of course, it's none of those things. But it's still conservatism. It's still right wing, and I think you can only just look at the extreme right figures in America, the literal neo Nazis, the white nationalists, the Christian nationalists, and see how happy they are to have Trump in office, and you realize, this is a right wing movement. But also, you look at people who used to work for Ronald Reagan or at least support him, who are also in the Trump administration, and realize you can look at that and say, it's not that he's not in keeping with conservatism; it's that he has functionally consumed it and reappropriated it for his own purpose.
Okay, and how one of the things that struck me about your speech, and you started to talk about it when at the beginning of this conversation, is the role of the media and how they have and how the Trump conservatives or the Trump ecosystem has created its own essentially independent. Well, yeah, that's not the right word, but its own media system, its own media ecosystem
And
that
it
really
is
is
independent
omnipresent
in some sense. Yeah,
if you want
yeah,
to absorb it wherever it is that you consume media.
yeah. And it's I've been thinking about this a lot. Like I said, in light of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, because I think you're actually right that a lot of this is independent in the sense that it is not owned by a corporation. It is a sole proprietorship or a small team, and it is not controlled by the Trump movement, but is emphatically supportive of it. So, let's like wind the clock back just a little bit, into the late 2010s, particularly during the pandemic, especially after the January 6th insurrection. Conservatives are increasingly raising the alarm and saying we are not welcome on big tech platforms or major social media sites, because in large part they weren't, and some of these were good reasons and some of them were bad reasons. But tens of thousands of conservative accounts were either suspended or censored in some way because they shared anti-vaccine misinformation, because they questioned lockdowns, because they dabbled in hate speech, or because they were part of the January 6th insurrection. Like, whatever the reason, again, good, bad, tenuous, reasonable. Scores of conservatives I think we're the span of tens of thousands of conservatives were kicked off or censored in some way on these platforms. And unsurprisingly, they didn't just kind of take their lumps and log off. They went looking for places to congregate. And people like Charlie Kirk really emphatically endorsed that migration to places like Getter and Telegram and Rumble and BitChute. And some of these platforms worked for a little while and then they failed. Some of them have continued. Some of them have thrived. But these are platforms that increasingly either were set up or pivoted with the goal of winning over conservatives, placating them, making them happy, and promoting them. Like Rumble, for example, is a really, really interesting case study. It's a Canadian company that began actually as a counter to YouTube to pay artists better, to pay videographers and musicians better royalties than YouTube could. And for years, it kind of worked that way. A couple of conservative, mostly right wing kind of conspiratorial voices migrated over to Rumble, and then more and more and more, and especially after January 6th, what they call the Great Deplatforming, tons more moved over. And Rumble basically went, well, we were broke, like we were not succeeding, we were getting killed by YouTube. Let's do this pivot. And they started putting all this stuff on the, for a while they resisted it. They put like cat videos on the front page, even as all of their top videos were like Alex Jones and like, a neo-Nazi, or QAnon believers or whatever. With time, they basically went, okay, fine, let's lean into it. And they started slapping all of these videos on their front page, and you go there now, and 100% of the content is either crypto, gambling, video games, or right-wing content. And so places like this became really interesting rallying points, recruitment kind of vectors, or sort of focus groups and message boards and organizing drives. And they help percolate some really interesting stuff, bad stuff mostly, but really interesting stuff. Some of these places, the ones that kind of got started before 2020, were the places where election denialist conspiracy theories and misinformation was cooked up. Some of these places are where some of the crazy racist anti-migrant misinformation that became really prominent in the most recent election are cooked up. Some of these places are literally controlled by the Russian government. Telegram is a huge network for right-wing figures in America, and we know that it's been compromised in 8 Ways to Sunday by Moscow. It was started by a Russian tech entrepreneur. Other platforms are more extremist in tone. Some are more establishment. One of them is literally owned by Donald Trump, Truth Social. The other one I mentioned, Rumble, actually has a big stake in Truth Social. So that there are vested economic interests in the success of Donald Trump in some of these platforms. This ecosystem exists largely without kind of general public participation, right? The average person does not go on Getter. I think that Getter is actually dead, or maybe Parlor, maybe no, Gab. Gab is the one that's still around. Average people don't go on these platforms. And that's kind of what helps them stay radical and ideologically consistent and sort of so community focused. I mean, the right wing has figured out how to do sort of healthy social media in the sense that everyone kind of gets along and is sort of discursive and popular. They figured out kind of smaller, more community oriented social media networks in a way that kind of the rest of us haven't, and it makes a space for the Trump movement to really kind of lay the grassroots groundwork, at least online. And it's kind of a scary thing.
So explain something. So you said something just now that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And so I'd like you to explain it a little bit more. If these are fairly niche sites that not a lot of people visit, right? You just said that average people, most people haven't even heard of these systems, never mind participate in them or see its content. Uh, I mean, then why do they have any kind of impact that is measurable? I mean, if it's a tiny niche audience and that most people haven't even heard of, okay, it's fine. So they have a place and they do their little thing over there. But if it's that tiny, how does it have an impact? Because your argument is that this is something very significant. I'm speaking with you today because we want to raise awareness of what is going on. But if it's tiny and they don't, people don't even know that it exists, how does it have an influence? How does it have an impact? Why are you obsessed with this? And because it's not, I mean, it's not a random obsession. You're concerned about the impact, right?
Yeah, for a very particular reason. I mean, too much of our study of these platforms, even from academia and the media and politics, kind of treats the internet like a series of hermetically sealed chambers, and that's not what it is. Of
Of
course, we all
course.
know this, but it's kind of, there's no other way to study this without talking about individual kind of discrete things and the individual communities, discrete as they are, around them. But again, that's not how the internet actually works. We know this pretty well. So let me give you a really concrete example. It is October 2024, and Donald Trump is getting killed in the polls, right? Like everybody assumes he's about to lose. Part of the reason why he's going to lose is because he's promising mass deportations, a thing that is actually quite unpopular with the broader American public, at least if you trust the pollsters. So he's getting absolutely killed. The big debate is a couple days away. He's facing Kamala Harris. We kind of expect things to go quite badly for him. And on 4chan, which is arguably one of the most old school, influential, popular, but also radical and extremist platforms out there, like it has been the preferred network for a number of extremist mass shooters, right? Like it is the birthplace of QAnon, the conspiratorial movement. It is an unpleasant place run by neo-Nazis, often for other neo-Nazis, whether they want to call themselves or not, doesn't really matter. So 4chan, there's some users are sitting around and they're literally discussing, how do we help Donald Trump win? They've done it before, right? Like they credit themselves with helping turn Donald Trump's candidacy into a serious thing in 2016. They're the ones who came up with the Pepe memes. They're the ones who came up with a lot of the kind of early discourse that made Trump sort of palatable, especially to young men. And so now they're sitting around a decade later and kind of chatting like, well, how do we sell this guy? Like, how do we get especially our hatred for immigrants kind of in the public zeitgeist? And this one user, like I found the post where he does this. This one user goes on Reddit and he finds this image. Somebody had posted it to like r/weird or something, like one of these kind of photo subreddits where people just kind of post funny things. He found a photo of this guy walking home, black dude, walking home with two geese, or what look like geese, two birds kind of in each hand. And so this 4chan user grabs this image and posts it to his pals and said, well, look, it's a Haitian migrant. I hear that they've been discussing this news story that said that Haitian migrants were plucking birds out of a fountain in Ohio, in this town in Ohio. And it's probably a nonsense report to begin with, but this 4chan user decides he just found an image that would illustrate that rumor. And he posts it and he said, look, this thing is evidence that these Haitian migrants are just eating random fowl in the park. And everyone gets super excited, think, okay, this is really good. A couple others find some reports from like a town away of someone's cats going missing, and then they find a post on Facebook that says, oh, well, I think it was the Haitians, even though it's a town totally different than, I think, Springfield, when we're talking about. They find other kind of rumors and nonsense. They kind of cobble it all together and they start pumping it out. Within an hour, it winds up on Twitter. Within a couple of hours, it's on Donald Trump Jr.'s Twitter page. Within a couple of days, Donald Trump mentions it at the debate. Donald Trump goes on stage and says the Haitians, they're eating the cats and the dogs, and we all laugh at it. But A, it came from this online sort of research arm of his movement, and B, it probably worked, right? Like it thrust into the narrative, into the election, this concern about, you can dress it up a lot, but this concern about foreigners coming into your small town and ruining things and turning you into San Francisco and importing backwards ideas and, all this sort of kind of racist claptrap. It worked. Like it objectively, we all thought it screwed him up. We all thought that people would reject this. We were wrong. People elected him en masse. So the way in which a lot of these places work is with this process in mind. And if you look at the people in Trump's cabinet, they're the ones who worked closely with these alternative platforms. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. did the gamut of Rumble shows and weird podcasts. Matt Gaetz, who was considered initially for Attorney General, hosted a show with Rumble. Kash Patel used to go on a bunch of these crazy QAnon shows that were totally banned from Twitter and YouTube back in the day, that are all on these platforms. There was this symbiosis there, both of using them as a recruitment center, but also using them as a research group and also doing focus testing with them, like focus group testing. the symbiotic relationship between these alternative platforms and the Trump movement and now administration is so deep, so wide, so integrated. Like it makes you sound crazy when you talk about it, but what's crazy is that this is where we're at.
Okay, but what's different about that? And let me explain what I mean. In that, okay, Trump has fans, and he's got partisans who are just pro Trump. Whatever Trump says, we love Trump. There were people who were big fans of Harris, and whatever it was that she said, they were big fans of. And we have that here in Canada. When Trudeau was prime minister, there were people that if he says it, it's the worst thing ever. And others who said anything that Trudeau says, he's my guy, and I'm all for it. We now have Mark Carney as PM, and there's no shortage of Canadians who are steadfastly behind Carney. And perhaps even more Canadians that are steadfastly behind Pierre Poilievre, and whatever he says is what they're in favor of too. So, is there something different about the folks that you're describing, from 4chan and Reddit and all these other small all these small online platforms where they get to talk to each other, or is that just, how is that different from standard political partisanship?
So I'll give you kind of a sideways answer to that. A couple of years ago, actually, in the fallout of the January 6th insurrection, the CBC hit me up and said, "Listen, we want to do a podcast that sort of explores, how we got here. What do you want to like? Do you want to do it? Do you have any ideas?" And I said, like, if you really want to have an interesting take on how America got to where it is, look at the rise of right wing conservative radio. And they're like, great, let's do it. So I ended up hosting this podcast, and it's called The Flamethrowers. If you want to look it up, I think it's quite good. But it traces America's politics, including the kind of the polarization and that I think you're referencing. That it's kind of just the natural state of politics, particularly in America. But it traces that, and it looks at radio as kind of a portal into it, right? And you can do this. Like there are times where right wing radio becomes a sort of a haven for those who kind of want to challenge the state, including those who are maybe who are extremists, right? Like one of the biggest radio stars in America is actually of all time is a Canadian. His name's Charles Coughlin, and he became a huge celebrity in the 20s and the 30s, like, to the point where like 1 in 4 Americans were listening to him. And he was a Catholic priest, and he was also kind of a socialist. He was an early supporter of FDR, and he was big on social justice and fighting the rich and elites. But he actually took this crazy turn to a sort of hard anti-Semitism, hard anti-Soviet, anti-communist bent, eventually pro-Nazi, pro-fascist. And he's this really interesting case study because he is kind of emblematic of this really intense polarization that hits America in the 30s. And he is kind of a barometer of how intense that interpersonal polarization ends up being. But in the end, he sort of fades away. America kind of has this come together moment, and things kind of go back to normal. And you kind of watch the ebb and flow of polarization go throughout the 20th century. What is really interesting about following that whole trend is that technology is not necessarily just a reflector of it. Of course, it's also a driver, right? So, like, as you see the proliferation of channels in the 90s and then the 2000s, including the rise of more shortwave broadcasters, the AM/FM dial split, more internet radio start to come out, you start to see this huge atomization of all of these voices, and you see an increasing extremism. Because back in the day, even Coughlin, you still had to sort of meet the general public where they were, because there was only a limited space on the dial. As space increased, you had increasing extremism and hyperpartisanship, and in some cases hate speech. Alex Jones comes out of this initial atomization, and I think you can actually follow that kind of increasing multiplicity of choice and take and perspective. You can trace that to an increasing kind of polarization in our own society, because it really kind of stress tests our social bonds and the reality that holds us all together, right? No longer do we all live in the same world. We all live in radically different worlds now. And I think, someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the prime example of that. By the way, a guy who also came into talk radio, just FYI. He found a way to cobble together this just completely incoherent, completely anti-scientific, actually disprovable meta theory about COVID-19 and vaccines and the state, like AIDS being a bioweapon, right? Like he has just the most insane collection of views, but he stitched it together and then sort of reflected it back onto his followers, and it has become dogma, right? Like Republicans have measurably shifted away from vaccines in large part because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has sort of imposed it onto them. Like that is a really fascinating and terrifying thing that we've never seen at this level before. Like it is happening faster, it's happening more intensely, it's happening more at the extremes, and you just can't get to that with the technology we have now. So, we may have always had a penchant for polarization, and there's no doubt we have in Canada. Like that's particularly true, right? Whether it's Quebec, rest of Canada, English, French, Indigenous settler, West Coast, East Coast, whatever. That divide has always been in Canada, but the ability for technology to to really drive those binaries and then turn them into 1,000 different kind of competing visions and realities, like that's a really powerful thing that we've not even begun to grapple with.
So let's talk about. We've been talking a lot about the states, but let's bring this home to Canada, because you and I are both Canadian.
Mm.
And are we just on the outside observing these trends in the United States and in a couple other countries, or are we also being swept up in this trend that you've observed?
We were getting swept up into it. There's no doubt. We were facing a lot of the same externalities that they were. I mean, the Freedom Convoy, I think it's a really, really great example. We faced a lot of fringe groups that were modeling themselves after some of the extremist groups in the U.S. We had politicians who in this country who wanted to be the next Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We have actually probably a higher percentage of alternative broadcasters in Canada than probably even the States has. So we have all of the ingredients, and you're right that a lot of them are taking their cues from the U.S. But what we also have is a higher trust society, a less polarized society to begin with, a less stratified society economically, and then also, all that stuff I think is fairly weak barriers to this going sideways. The most important thing we have going for us is just a constant desire to not be America. And it's sort of adolescent at times. It's sort of sophomoric. Like it is sort of dumb at times. The degree to which throughout history we have done things just out of kind of a desire to not be America. But in our current climate, it's serving us really well. Just the idea that Trumpism or Trumpian is an insult in Canada is great because it lets you dismiss, not always effectively, but it lets you dismiss the worst instincts of people, especially people who spend too much time online, as being like something we fundamentally dislike. And Donald Trump's increasing liberal behavior towards Canada and trade and territorial expansion and NATO and everything else, all of that is only deepening our kind of fundamental belief that the conditions that led to Trump were bad. The decisions that were made in America that gave them Trump were bad, and that we have to make different decisions. I don't know that that's going to hold forever, but it's holding right now, and it's currently doing us, I think, a fair bit of good.
Yeah, so let's talk about the last election just a few months ago. I know that you were deeply reporting deeply on that, and like if we go back to like February, March, or we'll go back to like February, right, January, or basically any time last year, and we knew that there was going to be an election at some point in in 2025, and every poll from everywhere, the only question was how big of a government. Like there was an outside chance that the federal conservative party would have a minority government, but really the only question was how big of a majority was it going to be. And then, two things happened. This is my analysis. I want you to weigh in on it. Two things happened. One, Trump won the election and started acting in ways that you just described that Canadians recoiled from, and Justin Trudeau resigned, and we got fresh blood, someone very different. Whether you like Carney or you don't, and you can weigh in on that if you wish. I don't think anybody can deny that he is a very different person and a very different politician than Justin Trudeau was. And, like, to my mind, those are like the two big things that happened, and either one or both were sufficient to get the Liberals a surprise fourth term and relegate the Conservatives to a minority. Now, I forget about this last past election, but I know in the previous one, the Conservatives actually got more votes nationally. Like, they won the popular vote, not half. Not they got a plurality of votes. They got more votes than the Liberals, but they didn't form a government. I forget whether that was true in the election just held a few months ago.
It wasn't, no.
No, okay.
Yeah.
So, but can you weigh in on how these events sort of radically changed what was expected to happen in Canadian politics, and like, did all of this media ecosystem that we've been talking about play a significant role?
It didn't play a significant role, not in the way that I thought it would, and thank God it didn't. Um, so going into this election, I mean, listen, I think the deck was stacked heavily in Carney's favor the moment that Trudeau exited, and not only that, but that Carney was quickly selected to be the alternative. Because listen, Canadians still have a rosy feeling about Mark Carney going back to the 2008 financial crisis. Those who remember it anyway. Maybe that's why he didn't do so well amongst youth. But those who remember him think quite fondly of him, and also the guy exudes confidence and competence, right? Like, you just can't get away with it. Like, I talked to conservative voters who were voting for him because it was like given the choice between young upstart guy who codes camp as conservative and serious central banker who seems vaguely nonpartisan, non-ideological, and just wants to get the job done. I'm going to go for the latter, obviously. So like that, I think, was baked in, and that really defined the election. And things didn't change a ton from day one to the last day. And if you want to read more about it, my new book, it just came out. It's about exactly this. It's called The 51st State Votes. So you can dive in and get the full story there. But what was interesting was Pierre Poilievre's inability to disrupt that, right? Like, there was a lot of avenues for Pierre Poilievre to sort of change the channel and find a way to get people thinking differently. And they didn't have a terrible message when it came to that, right? Like, Pierre Poilievre initially tried to ignore Trump and the threat of tariffs, and then sort of did a kind of tough guy routine that didn't work. But he ultimately settled on this message that I think was good. It wasn't enough, but it was a really interesting message, which was, we need to be strong at home so that we can defend ourselves against America and build up abroad, which is good. Like, it's a good argument. It was sort of like, we need to get things working. Everything that doesn't work here is hurting us in this fight. And I think that's a really interesting message, especially because Canadians still kind of suspect that things aren't working quite right in this country, not like they should be. But it didn't really go to that next level, right? Like, didn't really connect with the level of anxiety that people were feeling straight across the country. And also, it didn't disrupt what Canadians' sort of latent feeling about Pierre Poilievre is, which is the guy's kind of Trumpian, right? Like that is the thing that Pierre Poilievre has always faced, that he's never quite figured out how to weasel out of. And it's kind of unfair. Like, I've heard conservatives tell me, like, it's so unfair that he gets compared to Donald Trump. And they're right to some degree, right? Like, Pierre Poilievre is generally pro-immigration, wants some limits, but is not promising mass deportation, nor the sort of racist selection process that Donald Trump wants, right? Pierre Polyev is not anti-abortion. He's not anti-gay. He's not good enough on transgender rights, but he's certainly not proposing the same kind of dehumanization process that Donald Trump is. Pierre Polyev is at least kind of notionally in favor of NATO and standing for Ukraine and a bunch of other stuff, right? So like they're not the same politician, but Pierre Polyev keeps borrowing and has continuously borrowed from the Trump playbook, kind of where he thinks it will have an impact, right? Donald Trump goes and rails against the globalists. Pierre Polyev warns about the World Economic Forum. Donald Trump hires a bunch of anti-vaxxers and people who say the vaccine is a bioweapon and the COVID isn't real. Well, Pierre Polyev promotes a bunch of internal anti-vaxxers, goes to the Freedom Convoy, promises to ban federal vaccine mandates, kind of same deal. Donald Trump promises to slash foreign aid, saying it's all going to ideologues and terrorists. Pierre Polyev promises to slash foreign aid by basically the same degree. And it was to the point where I know that the Conservative Party was considering hiring the Republican Party's fundraising arm in the year before the election, ultimately decided not to do it, but nevertheless strongly considered it. And Pierre Polyev kind of, I think, and the reason all of these things are particularly true and the reason they wind up at the same conclusions is to some degree because they're both beholden to this online media ecosystem, right? Pierre Polyev goes and will boycott Canadian Press, Globe and Mail, whatever, will refuse to speak generally to the mainstream press, but will go and sit down with an anti-vaccine streamer on Facebook who has 2,000 followers. He'll go on to a podcast hosted by a woman who says that Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum secretly runs the Canadian government. He goes and speaks to the Rebel, which is tried repeatedly to ingratiate themselves in the Trump movement. He was constantly trying to figure out how to build linkages with the Canadian arm of that same right-wing MAGA information ecosystem. And I think it ultimately hurt him immensely. It made him look foreign and weird and shifty. It made him look Trumpian and sort of out to lunch. And it did not connect with people who were nervous, anxious, and who cared about the bottom line. That said, he still did really well. He didn't win the popular vote, but he won more votes than I think any conservative party going back to the 80s, maybe even the 70s. And it's hard to ignore that he still has a lot of the fundamentals right, and that he has a really active base who believe this stuff. But I think what really it comes down to for me, and maybe this is more of a moral position than a political one, but it is high time that he sort of become a leader and look at those people and say, listen, like, I'm not doing this anymore. The vaccines are safe. COVID wasn't a bioweapon. Klaus Schwab is just some dude in Switzerland who has no power over this country. I want to see him do that. I'm starting to think he never will.
All right. So let's give the. Is there a mirror on the flip side of the political spectrum? Is there a left-wing media ecosystem? I often hear when we're talking about the States, sure, you've got Fox News, and it is the most popular news channel, and that's definitely more on the right. But there's also MSNBC, which is coded left. Are these mirrors of each other on the flip side? If there's something unique and distinct about the right-wing media ecosystem, what is it that's different than the partisans that are also on the left?
Yeah, I mean, I think the both sides here just never carries any water, right? Like if you grabbed a person off of an uncontacted island, taught them English, sat them in front of Fox News for an hour, and sat them in front of MSNBC for an hour, and asked them their impressions of both, they would say Fox News feels like a parody channel for a Stalinist, a local Stalinist branch in Georgia, and MSNBC feels like a kind of cloyingly liberal news channel. They're not the same thing. And fundamentally, I suspect that if the left and the liberals could create a sort of propaganda information ecosystem that was that effective, they probably would. But A, they don't like there's not a lot of appetite, money behind it. B, there's not the audience there. Like, liberals love fighting with each other. They don't like hearing a central message. And finally, there's just not the political culture for that on the left right now. That may change in 20 years. Like, we may see a world where, the Marxist Leninist Weekly is the biggest newspaper for liberals in America. Like, I don't know. But I somehow doubt it. But what I do know is that if you look at dollars, viewers, creators, view counts, everything else for the stacked up right wing media ecosystem, and then compare it with the commiserate volumes for the left, like, it dwarfs it 100 to 1. Like, there's no competition. And people can lament. I hear conservatives lament, "Oh well, the New York Times is crazy lefty." The New York Times employs some of the most hard right columnists in America, and have for years. Like, it is a liberal paper, but it is a place that has a diversity of viewpoints, and kind of sometimes annoyingly so. Rod Dreher is a hard right Catholic nationalist who has written consistently for the New York Times. I don't think he does anymore, but he used to for a very long time. Ross Douthat is a similar kind of right wing figure who writes for the Times, and I think that's really what sets us all apart, is that the liberal media still, maybe strategically stupidly, still holds fast on the idea that you need a diversity of viewpoints, and you need a real debate, and you need strong figures from the other side to make your position stronger. Now, if you go further to the left and you go to some more fringe places, you can start finding outlets that are kind of uniformly left-wing ideological, but they're consistently small, like, they're consistently marginal. And where they exist, they tend to be an add-on to a regular media diet. Like, if you look at someone like Hassan Piker, who is probably the most successful and popular left-wing news influencer in America right now, he is very much an add-on to the New York Times and CNN and BBC and Al Jazeera and everything else. It's not really a competition. Like, his message is often, yeah, maybe the corporate media can't really be trusted, but you have to go read kind of everything, and you have to round out your diet. You go on the right and you hear these influencers who are saying, if you're reading the New York Times, you're an idiot. If you're listening to CNN, you're an idiot. I mean, there are a huge number of right-wing influencers who will tell you that Fox News is too left-wing and can't be trusted. There are people who sit on Twitter all day now and who argue with Grok, the AI created by Elon Musk, kind of emphatically to support his very particular kind of right-wing ideology. They sit there and say that Grok is trained on left-wing bias. So you just cannot compare A and B. The number of left-wing individuals who swear off all news, who refuse to listen to any mainstream voice, who don't trust anything produced by a journalist, is so much vanishingly smaller than the same proportion who do that on the right. And again, that may flip someday. I'd be a little surprised if it does. We've seen this problem always be more of an issue of the right than the left, and I don't think that's going to change. But I guess there's no particular reason why it can't.
So yeah, so I tend to think of the world right now less so in terms of left and right wing, and more on a spectrum of between authoritarian and democratic. So like, if we look at Venezuela, that's authoritarian, coded left. If we look at Brazil, we had it was definitely swinging towards authoritarian, coming back more towards democracy in the last election. Similarly, Poland had 8 years of increasingly authoritarian state, new elections, coming back towards more democratic norms. We also have countries like Hungary, and with India under Modi, and I have no idea how to code like Modi on a left-right spectrum, or Russia. Is Putin a right wing or a left wing? Either way, definitely more authoritarian, and certainly what we're seeing coming out of the States is definitely more authoritarian. Would you connect the a left, white, right spectrum with a authoritarian democratic spectrum, or are these just independent axes that you can have you can be extremes on in any of those four quadrants?
Yeah, there's a really interesting book that I'm reading at the moment. I'm going to blank on the name of the author, but it's called "Everything Was the Same Until It Was No More." Everything was forever until it was no more, and it's a book that looks at the late stages of the USSR, and it pioneers this idea of hypernormalization, where uh, particularly as the communist system had become sort of just more dysfunctional than ever, and it had become just it had grown to be in violation of all of its principles, whatever principles they may have been. And the more it sort of knew that it wasn't working, and that everyone knew it wasn't working, and yet continued to kind of propagate its existence, he kind of posits this idea that people went into this state of hypernormalization, where they no longer believed in the things they were doing. They no longer believed in the system in which they lived. And they no longer believed the media. They no longer trusted their leaders, but they kind of continued doing the sort of rituals of the state and the society. In some cases, did them even more forcefully because nothing made sense, and nothing sort of worked. And I think about this sometimes. I've been thinking about this in terms of particularly Russia and the U.S. right now, where, again, like I said earlier, nothing about this is conservative. Nothing about Russia's war in Ukraine is making it great, or bringing it back to a past empire. Nothing about, let's say, Hungary is sort of traditionalist. Nothing about the UK's break from the European Union is giving them better and more independence. Nothing about these sort of just paradoxical and incoherent populist moves that are designed to sort of shake and rattle democracy. Nothing about this is sensible or logical or progressive or conservative. Um, but everybody is kind of throwing themselves into it with this sort of intensity and willingness to put aside all these incoherencies that I find really fascinating. It is this hypernormalization. So this is a really roundabout way of saying I think there's a lot of left wing people who are just continuing to throw themselves into this belief in these systems, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Cuba, whether it's in some cases even Russia or China. They're throwing themselves into support for these systems, even kind of fully realizing that these systems are not what they actually believe in, do not correspond to their values in any way. But they have all the trappings of it, so they're throwing themselves into it even more forcefully. Ditto for the right. Um, I think that is a kind of an example of a system where we've become so, it's maybe a little philosophical, but where we become so postmodern, and so sort of um, at a malaise with our democracy and society, that we're just trying to look for things to believe in and symbols to identify with. And I kind of think about that in terms of how you can still call someone like Narendra Modi conservative, or Vladimir Putin even a traditionalist, or Donald Trump a conservative, or Nicolas Maduro a leftist. Like, none of this is true. These people are all just autocrats, nationalists, fascists, authoritarians. But the fact that anybody, whether they're in Canada or in those countries, is still kind of endorsing those movements out of this belief in symbolism, I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, it reminds me of a book came out about a decade ago entitled "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible," and
Yeah,
it's kind of
yeah, very similar. Yeah,
about Russia uh, uh, in of what Russia is like in like the 2010s to 2013
yeah.
era, like with the rise of the oligarchs and uh, uh, it's kind of fascinating. All right, you've been very generous with your time. I've got a couple more questions. Look, I am very interested in being informed, but I do not have an infinite amount of time. I don't have the time to be obsessed with this, to dive as deeply as you have. And I know a lot of my audience shares this desire to have an actual understanding of what is going on in the world. And I'm not and I know it's like objectivity is nice as a goal, but it's not actually something that is obtained. But if you want to be reasonably informed without spending an infinite amount of time verifying sources, what are some strategies to employ as an individual just to have as accurate an understanding of what's going on in the world as possible, removing as many of those filters as is practical to do, that giving only a very slanted perspective or skewed or selective or reporting on events.
Yeah, yeah, I it's a good question, and I think it's a lot of the strategies we had developed 5 years ago are obsolete. A lot of the strategies we adopted 10 years ago backfired.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, I can't keep up. I realize, like I haven't really changed my media reading habits in the last, like since the pandemic, and I know it needs to change. But for me, what's really daunting is how do I find the time to invest to recreate habits that I can employ when I even have the sense that even if I do a really good job today, I'm going to have to do that again in 2 or 3 years anyway.
yeah, listen, I think there's a handful of things, right? Like, one is you don't have to know everything all the time. There's just been this horrible trend that was initially wondrous and fun and exciting, where we all got to be generalists at everything. The advent of Wikipedia meant we got to learn but everything and anything at all times. Um, but it became exhausting and it drove us all mad, right? Like it created faux experts out of idiots, and it makes us all anxious that we're not as smart as we want to be.
Right.
So, like, to some degree, like, I often tell people, people will ask me, like, how do I keep up with the far right? And I'll tell them, don't. Like, you don't have to. There's no reason for you to. Like, there will be times where we'll kind of come, where you'll have to look for, whether people like me or actual experts, you have to look for people going, hey, red flag, like extremist experts over here, this is a problem. Those times will come, and look for those when those happen. But no, you don't have to spend your weeks worrying what Alex Jones is saying. That's not helpful for you in your day-to-day life. It does not help you be a better citizen. It requires that somebody do it. It doesn't have to be you. So, like, that's an important thing to be. And this is, like, I don't know anything about the state of chemistry. Like, I have no idea what's happening in terms of, we may have discovered some new chemical compound I've never heard. I don't have to know about that, right? Like, ditto for physics. Like, I'm not a science guy. I trust that they're working on it, and I trust that I don't have to know about it until it's really important. So, like, that is an important thing to keep in mind. You don't have to care and know about everything everywhere all at once. The other part of it is, we got to go back to having both faith and a willingness to seek out experts. There has been this trend where we think experts will get served to us, or where we look at experts with a level of suspicion. And, like, there's not a lot of mystery as to why. The pandemic made us loopy. We felt like we got lied to by, I know I feel this way anyway, I feel like I got lied to by people who profess to be experts, who sold strategies like curfews and lockdowns that didn't work, even as they told us the science was there, right? Not to say that they never worked, but in some cases they were used and abused. I think you know this if you lived in Ontario or Quebec in 2022. But we have to get back to that strategy of saying, okay, listen, I need to keep in my head the names of a handful of experts on this thing that I care about, and I need to know to check with them if something like this comes up, right? Like, if you have a journalist that you know is really good at health policy, go seek them out when a new health thing comes up. Don't just expect that someone's going to serve you this person up, or that the algorithm will treat you to them, because they probably won't. So, like, I think that's really important, and I think the more we can also promote good experts is really helpful as well, and not just the expert you heard on a podcast, but the expert whose credentials you at least did a cursory search, and who is backed up by other experts as well. Like, that's I think a really important thing to underline. And then, kind of thirdly, we need to figure out a better delineation between entertainment and information. There's nothing wrong with pop science. There's nothing wrong with kind of pop politics. But the constant mixing of entertainment and serious content has not helped us. And this is not even necessarily the problem of consumers. In many cases, I know from experience, it's the problem of producers, people in my business. And it is something we have to untangle. Like, listen, I love YouTube. Like, I love, at the end of the day, putting on YouTube and watching somebody break down an esoteric thing or a big news story over 15, 20 minutes. Like it's something I'm working on as well. Um, but, I also don't expect that this 3-person production team who's running a YouTube channel that runs once a week is going to get everything right. I'm not going to hold on to them as the source of absolute truth. I'm going to have to sit there and go, yeah, they've done a good job. They didn't convince me of everything. I'm not going to internalize all of these beliefs 100% and live my life based on them, but it helped me it gave me some stuff to think about. I say this because there are people who listen to Joe Rogan every week, and not just Joe Rogan, also a whole bunch of other podcasts, some featuring quasi experts, some featuring people who profess to be experts. People listen to podcasts every week and then internalize the ideas from them and go and live their life based on that one source, because they are doing the same mechanism that we used to do watching the evening news, right? Like you assumed that the evening news was a source of truth, and it often was, because it was the product of rigorous fact checking and the work of dozens of people and the input of a lot of experts and sources and producers and editors and reporters. You could trust that the thing you got on that hour package was reliable and comprehensive and encapsulating a lot of different perspectives. You can't have that same faith for the YouTube show with 3 people working on it. But because they arrive at our house the same avenue, I think we often treat them the same way mentally, and I think it's a real mistake. Ditto for podcasts and radio. Because these things feel so similar to a source of truth that we used to rely on, I think we still put our faith in them enormously, and I think it's a huge mistake. We need to figure out how to get back to a more traditional media diet. I think all the things I just described are basically saying that. And it can feel weird because it feels like we're going backwards, right? Like it feels like we've discovered new technology and now we want to go back to playing in the mud. But new technological advancements are not always designed to create strategies that make us smarter. In this case, and I think this is true with AI and LLMs, I think this is true with the atomization of this media ecosystem. The strategies we're developing to cope with this new technology are making us stupider.
Well, that's as good an encapsulation as any that I've heard of applying the classic skeptic philosophy to our media and
Yeah.
how to
I guess I'm preaching to the choir to some degree.
Go through life. No, I appreciate that. So thank you, Justin. I want to thank you for a much more wide-ranging conversation than I was expecting. That's great. I love how the wide-ranging topics that we covered tonight. Do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a bad spot right now. I don't think anybody can be watching the news and feel good about where we are right now. I really like, my advice increasingly is that we all have to log off a lot more, right? Like I'm saying these strategies for like kind of online media consumption, but I increasingly believe that we just shouldn't be consuming as much media as we do online. And when we do, we have to opt for things that are smarter, and where possible, we need to go out into the meat space again and like just talk to people regularly. Engage your politicians face to face, not via email or tweet. Participate in public forums again. Like, democracy is not a thing that happens to us; it is a thing we have to make happen. And you can't do that online. Like, we're just increasingly realizing you can't do that online, not to the same quality as we used to do in person. So you get out in the world again. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir to some degree, but convince your friends who don't do that.
All right. And if people want to learn more about you, I knew about you for several years as a journalist. I've read your works for years. If others want to follow you, read your back catalog and read your current works, where can people find you and learn more about you?
Yeah, I think my website is justinling.ca. It has all my links to everything there. But I'm on Blue Sky, which is the least toxic social media platform I could find. I read a Substack called Bug-eyed and Shameless that is about a lot of this media ecosystem stuff. And I have a column in the Toronto Star that runs pretty regularly. So any of those places are as good as any, but I also have a new book out. So like I said, 51st State Votes. It's also worth reading, I hope. It's pretty quick, just 100 pages. So.
Okay. Well, we'll put links to all of that in the show notes. So if you're interested, please follow that. Justin Ling, thank you for being my guest today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.